Hey guys, so last time we kind of finished up talking about watershed components, and so today we're going to kind of get into actual surveys and what the government's looking for, or why they're doing it, kind of. So it all starts in the 1970s. Congress in 1972 actually enacted the Clean Air Act, which under that also enabled the Clean Water Act. And its main goal is to protect the nation's waterways, including surface waters and coastal waters. So it basically, under that, it requires local governments to set up, or not set up, but to meet performance standards for pollution control, and within that, they're supposed to develop kind of their own branch that will assess those areas. So basically, it's kind of all of this, but then it protects. It's designed to protect valuable habitat for environmental. Goodness. Anyway, so basically, under the Clean Air and Water Act, the government agencies that were created was first the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, and it's basically responsible for monitoring clean air and water in the United States. And then each local government or state government is also supposed to have its own version of the EPA or own branch of the EPA that monitors water quality. And in Texas, that is the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, or the TCEQ. It used to be several other branches used to, like the Railroad Commission and something else, used to do clean air and water for Texas, but then it became cumbersome, so they brought it all together under the TCEQ back in 2003. So the TCEQ is a relatively new Texas entity, but it's been around in some shape or form since the 70s. So basically, what the EPA calls the reason for assessing water quality, or the uses that we want to be able to maintain with water quality kind of in mind, is that we want to be able to ensure that aquatic life and wildlife have clean environments. Then fish and shellfish consumption needs to be protected. In other words, you need to be harvesting fish and shellfish for food from areas that are protected and monitored. Then drinking water supply obviously needs to be monitored and protected. Areas used for recreation, so our local lakes used for recreation, need to be monitored. And then agriculture use is another beneficial use for the public. So what do these mean? They're pretty self-explanatory, but a water body, for aquatic life and wildlife support, a water body will provide suitable habitat for survival and reproduction of desirable fish, shellfish, and other aquatic organisms. For fish and shellfish consumption, basically it supports populations of fish and shellfish that do not pose a human health risk to consumers. So fish are going to be free from contaminants, or free of contaminants, and then shellfish will be free of toxins and pathogens. Then the drinking water supply. Obviously, water needs to be safe to drink. It's basically drinking water comes from multiple places, so surface waters and then groundwater. So it can look into groundwater retrieval as well, but main thing is water in municipalities needs to be drinkable. That can actually branch off the TCEQ. TCEQ usually will assess municipalities' water, but really municipalities set up their own testing to then report to TCEQ usually. So like the Denton Water Treatment Plant is going to treat their water and test their water, and then every once in a while TCEQ will audit them. Then recreation, basically there's primary contact recreation, which is where people are actually in the water, using the water, and then secondary is people who are not necessarily in direct contact with the water, but will probably contact it to some degree. So like you're boating, here it says canoeing, and yeah, if you're just hanging out on the beach at the lake, that would probably be part of the recreational secondary contact. I'm not going to worry too much about primary versus secondary. Just know that recreation is one of the beneficial uses that water is monitored for. And then agriculture is going to be, obviously, is water suitable for livestock and watering fields. And so water will be monitored with that in mind. Then there are some additional beneficial uses that the EPA looks at, but they aren't tested as strenuously. The first is landscaping, so just your residential use of water on your area landscapes, or cities' use of water on area landscapes. Power generation, for hydroelectric, for instance, it doesn't really matter too much what kind of water is passing through that, but then the other aspect of it is cooling towers. So water used for cooling purposes in power generation will be monitored when it is reintroduced back into lakes or river systems. And then industrial processing and or cooling, which is kind of the same idea as the power generation. A lot of industrial plants intake water to cool machinery and then output water, so that has to be monitored. So basically there's 5 levels of I guess attainment that the EPA will designate for these areas. So if we're looking at an area and we want to, or a water source, and we're wanting to determine if it is good for, say, fish and shellfish consumption, then we're going to designate it as a 1 through 5, where 1 fully, it's clean, it's good, you can use it, and then 5 is don't go near there for that purpose. In fact, they'll probably throw up some chain link fences and have some stark warnings about what you're able to do there. So the number 1 is that you can use it for that, and all you would be able to use it for anything you want. And then a threatened overall use would be 2. That means that there's a couple of those uses that might not be used, and then partially supporting the overall use means that a couple of those are further inhibited. Not supporting overall use is where basically it's getting worse, and then not attainable means that the state has performed a study that actually says that nothing is achievable for human consideration in that area. So a 5 is like let's put a chain link fence around it with barbed wire on top of it and signs that say keep out, if that makes sense. And there's actually some places in the DFW area that have that. So what are they assessing typically when they're looking at these things? Mostly what they're looking for is coliforms. In some cases, this isn't the only thing, but if you're talking about a level 5, then it could be like heavy metal pollution. Could be all sorts of other pollutants that are in there. But for the most part, that number 1, in order to clear you for a number 1, we're going to look at coliforms. And coliforms are basically just a bacteria colony that comes from usually some sort of, and really what we break it down to then is fecal coliforms, which comes from feces of organisms. What we look for typically in our water sources is E. coli, which is a bacteria that lives naturally in your gut, that helps you digest food and get nutrients from it. But when it's outside of your gut and you ingest it, it can make you really, really sick to the point of death. So what we're looking for is E. coli in our water sources, and if we find E. coli there, then that indicates to us that if we are doing things where we would ingest the water, then we could potentially get sick. So we typically will base ours on fecal coliforms and in particular E. coli coliforms. So the first thing we kind of need to understand with that is that these water environments, these aquatic environments, are teeming with microbial life. Bacteria are going to be microscopic life. You can't see them unless you use a microscope. And there are literally millions upon billions of bacteria that live in our waterways, and a lot of them are supposed to be there. We need them there. It's these tiny little microscopic ecosystems that we need going on. But when things get out of whack and things are in areas where we don't need them, then we need to stay away from those areas. And specifically, that's going to be our fecal coliforms, which are really just going to be, as it says here, the tip of the iceberg, meaning that 90% of the microbial story is actually beyond those fecal coliforms. But if we can see the tip of the iceberg, then we can steer away from disaster. So what we do then for the EPA, for Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ, is we look at how many coliforms can be in different areas. So in your drinking water, how many fecal coliforms do you want? You don't want any. You don't want to be drinking fecal coliforms. And in fact, here at school, what we're going to be doing, and you'll miss out on this at home, but we'll kind of maybe try to keep you involved, show you a couple videos of what we're doing just so you can see. We are going to be testing some water samples here for fecal coliforms, and then taking those and further dividing out those coliforms to see if we can find the morphology of those coliforms, which will then tell us the likelihood that they might be E. coli, which then tells us, oh no, that's not good to be around. So we'll be doing some testing here, and I'll kind of pop in a couple videos here and there of what we find so you can see it. But we'll test some drinking water around here. They've been kind of redoing the bathrooms and whatnot all around campus, so who knows what will happen. But in the 15 years that I've been doing this, we have never had a coliform positive count come from any of the drinking water from here on campus. In fact, we've also tested the toilets every year, and we've never had toilet water with fecal coliforms because your municipalities want you to have clean toilet water too, so we actually pipe drinkable water to your toilets. Once that water gets to your house, whatever goes up to your house is what's coming from the water treatment plant, and it is all clean water, ready to go. It's drinkable water. So the water coming out of your garden hose in the front yard, if you've ever heard never drink that, the reason you're not supposed to drink that is because you probably have a rubber hose that has like BPA's and all sorts of stuff in it that could potentially cause you to get ill. But and there's water sitting in the hose sometimes that can go bad. But for the most part, the water that's coming out of your faucet spigot there at your house is drinkable. Water that's going to your toilets is drinkable, and typically there are no coliforms in that. So if there are coliforms in that, then usually we go on boil notices. So like when the power went out the other day, they were having pumping issues, and they were worried that some of the pipes might have burst and contaminants might have gotten in there, so they issued the boil water notices. That was in case there were coliforms present, which, if you remember that, when that was going on, it took about 2 days for them to test the water to see if it did have stuff in it. And once they tested it, 2 days after the notice went out, they basically issued a new notice that you didn't have to boil water anymore. And that's because the testing takes over 24 to 48 hours to get results, and we're actually going to start our testing with that test. So basically we will inoculate a plate for testing, and then it will have to kind of do its thing for about 24 hours, and then we'll come back and we'll check it. Once we get the results from that, if there was anything on there, we would have to do further tests to see if it is actual coliforms that could cause issue. If it were, then the boil notice would continue. If there weren't any on there, then the boil notice would be rescinded. So For recreational water, though, notice that if you're just recreating in water, 200 fecal coliforms per 100 milliliters is allowable. And then for fish and wildlife habit, notice that number goes way up. There's 5,000 fecal coliforms that can be in there. That's suggesting that you don't need that water for people to play in, but fish and animals are going to use it and live there and do okay there. And then shellfish consumption is going to be 14 fecal coliforms per 100 milliliters, and that's because you are eating and consuming things from that. So you want those numbers to be relatively low. So how do these contaminants find their way into ecosystems? So basically there's naturally occurring ways, and then there's non-natural or human interventions that cause this. Normal natural limits are going to be just set by nature. So what usually would be nature's good at filtering itself and limiting itself, and so what natural left alone does is typically where we can kind of set our normal limits. Now, there are some natural events that can occur that throw natural balances out of order, so volcanoes, floods, fires, those types of things. Those could change those limits and then cause impairments in that area. So there's contaminants that can be natural, so they're outside of the norm, basically. And then obviously we know that humans can do things. Basically there's two types of human waste. One is called point source pollution, and the other is called non-point source. So the way that I remember it is point source, you can point at the source and say that is it. That is who did it. And usually that includes some sort of lawsuit or fine or something of that nature. Non-point source, you cannot point at one particular source because there is a broad area over which the pollution came. So let me just give you a quick rundown of that, and we'll talk about some examples later. But if Tro's Stinky Gas Company comes in and they are illegally dumping oil into a river, and we catch them doing that, that is point source pollution. I can point at the source and I can say that is who did it. It was Tro's Stinky Gas Company, right? Non-point source is where Tro's truck out in the parking lot is leaking oil. Maybe yours is out there leaking oil, someone else's is out there leaking oil. The parking lot covers a vast area. There's lots of oil leaks that are small in amount. When it rains, that oil gets washed off the pavement and goes into the same creek where Tro's Stinky Gas Company dumped oil, right? That is coming from multiple sources and being washed into the same location. So that is going to be called non-point source. I can't point at where that molecule of oil specifically came from, because it could have come from Tro's truck or Johnny's truck or Jimmy's truck or Billy's truck or whatever in that parking lot. But I can point at the point source. So that's kind of that. This is kind of a breakdown of what humans do. So natural events could be fires, winds, disease, flood, volcanoes, climate change. All of those could be things that will affect how water flows and potentially water quality. Then humans typically will do flood control, timber production, urban development, hydroelectric power, agriculture, and mining. Those are all things that humans will intervene and affect river flow and quality. So we are going to stop there, and then next time we'll pick up and talk about some specifics of point source versus non-point source and how these things can be controlled or mitigated using what are called BMPs, or best management practices. So for now, just kind of talking about why we do what we do, knowing the Clean Air and Water Act 1970-72, knowing the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, EPA, 5 beneficial uses, and then the 5 recommendations of waterways, and then also what is acceptable in terms of coliforms in each of those 5 uses is kind of a good start. While that's going on, or while this is going on, we'll be doing some bacterial testing here. I'll pop in a couple quick videos every now and then showing you kind of what we're doing so you can see what's going on in our actual waters around campus. So yeah, there will be a quiz on this particular section, and then moving forward, after we talk about the other stuff, we'll get down the road there. As Unit 9 comes to a close, there will be one more unit, and then I will also discuss some other things down the road with you.